Here we go. All right. Well, thank you for joining us today for the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History Lunch and Learn, Darned, Patched, and Mended, Repairing Textiles in 18th Century America. Our presenter today is Emily Whitted, a PhD candidate at the University of Massachusetts studying the history of textile mending in early America. Combining material culture analysis and archival research, her project explores the everyday practices of textile repair work completed with needles and thread within 18th century homes, ships, and military camps. Emily is a New England Regional Fellowship Consortium grantee, and she was at the Connecticut Museum a while back conducting research and viewing many textiles in our collection. So we're really excited to hear a little bit about her findings today. So welcome, Emily.
Thank you. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen with you all. All right. Hopefully you are seeing that screen. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for spending your lunchtime hour with me over Zoom today. As Jen mentioned, my name is Emily Whitted. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and my current dissertation work focuses on textile mending and repair work in early America. And before we dive deeply into that topic today, I first wanted to share a little bit about how I first decided to pursue research on this topic and why I think it's such an important conversation for us to be having right now. Many of you listening today may already have some experience with mending some of your own items at home, or maybe you have never picked up a sewing needle before, but I bet many of you have noticed that conversations about repairing the things we own seems to be on the rise. And mending in particular is having a real moment in public discourse. The COVID-19 pandemic has also inspired a return towards activities like mending, where many Americans are trying their hands at mending their own clothes for the first time. And this is just a 2020 New York Times article discussing that very phenomenon. And trends like visible mending, which often involve repairing textiles with brightly colored fabric patches or embroidery, are forms of artistic expression that are also quite popular right now. And they're also commenting on the limited lifespan of fast fashion textiles. So we're having more conversations about how short a time our clothing seems to last, or how quickly we might throw away clothing that we no longer want or need. And the importance of recycling and reuse in light of a climate crisis. Given the heightened awareness of fast fashion's damaging environmental impact and increasing rates of consumption and disposal, uncovering the historical roots of repair in America has never been more vital. So I wanted to investigate how early Americans cared for their textiles through repair work and the particular characteristics of some of that labor. And it seemed like right now was the correct time to try and answer those questions. I was also inspired by the large number of mended early American textiles I was discovering in museum collections up and down the East Coast while researching for some other projects, including this very fun pair of mended stockings, which were once owned by Stephen Girard of Philadelphia, who was at one point the wealthiest man in the early Republic. And so when wearing this pair here on the screen, Girard would have had a secret hidden inside his shoes. From the knees to the ankles, his legs would have been clad in these very fine knit silk stockings imported from France with very delicate silk embroidery, known as clocking, on display if he was wearing breeches. But below the ankle, out of sight within his shoes, his stocking feet would have been thick with mended areas, also known as darns, which were sewn to repair holes in the original fabric. And so my study of these stockings and other objects really begged the question, if the wealthiest man in early America was extensively mending his stockings, although I don't believe he was doing that labor himself, What was the culture of mending in early America more broadly? One can only imagine the sheer scale of textile repair work in early America as both a domestic task and a professional occupation. And that is generally what I'm finding in my research today. Mending was a ubiquitous practice completed by both women and men in a number of early American spaces, in and around homes, in professional workspaces, in military camps, and even at sea on board ships. But the characteristics and economic impact of the labor of mending, as well as the motivations behind it, really range, which offers us a close textured glimpse into the lives of many individual early Americans with their own complex relationships to the textiles that they made, bought, used, and repaired. While eye-catching color and embroidery in visible mending wants visitors to notice repair work, in early America, those executing textile repair work, the overwhelming majority of whom were women, were much more concerned with their men's escaping notice. With needles and thread, damaged textiles could be repaired to extend the life of garments without drawing any additional attention. Threads could be selected to match fabric colors, and even woven or knit patterns could be mimicked. And function was also important. Mended textiles would need to sustain additional wear, as necessity often justified the time and the labor spent repairing garments. But need was not the only motivating factor for mending. Like many of us today, repair in early America could also be motivated by sentimentality, as objects that are meaningful then, as now, felt worth the additional care and attention of repair work. So my dissertation research has taken me to a number of archives and museum collections, but it is thanks to a generous grant from the New England Regional Fellowship Consortium that I was able to explore the amazing archives and textile collections at the Connecticut Museum earlier this fall. And I'm going to be sharing highlights of my research in that collection with you all today. The labor of textile repair work, completed with needles, thread, and fabric, was accomplished by a wide variety of early Americans, but overwhelmingly women, bound and free, executed textile repair work as part of plain sewing or needlework trades, noting both their unpaid domestic maintenance and professional work paid outside the home in surviving archival records and in textiles preserved in collections today. And diaries are one popular source where I see men's mentioned, especially diaries by early American women who were interested in documenting their daily labors or economic activities, as opposed to some forms of diaries that are more devoted to religious reflection. And this, there's a diary in the library at Connecticut Museum from 1828 to 1830 by a woman named Samantha Barrett of New Hartford, Connecticut. And she's one writer who is focusing on documenting these economic activities. And she's recording a great deal of her textile labor, like spinning and weaving, but she's also recording some of her own personal repair work. She's writing down when she's mending her gown, which would have been labor she completed as part of her regular household maintenance, taking care of her own garments and sometimes the garments of her immediate family members. In the 1765 to 1701 diary of Martha Church Challoner, whose the pages here are pictured on the screen, she also is commonly listing textile activities that she completed or others completed for her, including this entry. It's kind of split onto two pages, the bottom of the one on the left and the top of the right. On December 13th, 1766, that paid a woman named Mrs. Hevelin £4 in full for mending my stays, making Suk's cloak, and little Sarah's gown. And Martha's household included multiple enslaved people, including a woman named Suki, and her diary also notably records clothing being made or fabric being issued directly to those multiple enslaved people in her household to then be made into clothes. So this is a particularly powerful source because many enslaved people were unable to document their experiences in the form of diaries. And so if we are able to read through Martha's words, we can access some of their own textile experiences as well. But Martha's payment of cash to Mrs. Heflin is also illustrating some of the economic impact of mending textiles outside of one's own household. That's pay that Mrs. Heflin is receiving for her professional labor. The mending of clothing itself could also serve as a form of payment, operating as a traded service for other goods or services. And one example of this can be found in the account book collection of Dr. William Adam. And Forbes and Adam, which was a business partnership that included an ironworks operation as well as a general store, produced a series of account books documenting goods on hand, customers' purchases, and their payments, which were often combinations of currency and coin, other goods, and labor, which is pretty typical for this time period. But Forbes and Adam segmented out all of their female customers into what they labeled as the woman's book, which they wrote on the front cover, listing their transactions, but only often recording these women's names as they were linked to their husbands if they were married. So, for example, in 1787, a woman just referred to as John Forbes's wife in the account book rang up a long tab for items that included a spelling book, a bushel of carrots, leather for a child's pair of shoes, sugar, rum, and tea. And then on the next page, she's paying off her debt with a variety of textile labor, including mending. She's mending a coat. She's also footing stockings, which is a process of repairing knit stockings by replacing the damaged feet by knitting entirely new ones. And this is also a common form of early repair work on knitted fabric that you'll see. But textual descriptions alone cannot fully convey the variety in creative problem solving and skill needed to repair textiles in early America. For the women like Samantha, Martha, and John Forbes' wife, who were all described or describing mending textiles, no two objects wear and break exactly the same. So neither are two objects repaired exactly the same. Yet, if we only looked at those words and those small descriptors, common terms, or minimal details, we might assume that these three women had the exact same skill sets with needles, but that is probably not true. Mending textiles actually requires a deep understanding of making in order to adequately execute repair. But the mender is also constrained by the state of the damage and must think creatively to mend as effectively and invisibly as possible. So as a result, material evidence, sometimes combined with written sources, can help to access and categorize the varieties in skill, motivation, and embedded meanings behind mending. For example, one of the most spectacular archival sources I found in the library collection was the diary of Rebecca Noyes, who was a Stonington, Connecticut resident who recorded daily diary entries from 1801 to 1831, which is a really valuable glimpse into daily practices across almost an entire lifetime. And she is often repairing her own clothing or the clothing of her sister or other family members. While Rebecca's entries are often only a sentence or two each day, sometimes maybe only a few words, she is notable for recording very specific material details. And so because she's often specifying which exact item of clothing she's mending, I can track which items she's mending regularly across time. Some of the same gowns are coming back again and again to be repaired, which is especially helpful to me in my work. And sometimes she's sharing her thoughts about how she feels about her repair work. And a particular favorite entry of mine was in May of 1814, which is pictured here on the page, Rebecca describes the process of her repairing a, quote, changeable silk gown, which is a fabric also commonly known as shot silk in the period, where the fabric's warp threads and weft threads are 2 or more different colors, which gives the fabric a really fun iridescent color. And on May 16th, she writes, Tuesday, I began to repair my changeable silk with Sister B, her sister's assistants, found it very rotten, which is underlined. And then on the 17th and 18th, she writes, very busy, probably still mending her gown. And on the 19th, she writes, Friday, I finished my gown. I hope it will pay me for doing it, but I fear it will not. But what does Rebecca really mean by rotten silk? Why did it take so long to mend this particular gown? And why does she seem uncertain if the end result was even worth all of her efforts? That's where collections can come into play. This is an example of a 1790 to 1810 mended silk waistcoat and breeches in the museum's collection. And by studying it, we can begin to understand Rebecca's entry a little more clearly about the difficulty in repairing silk fabric in particular. This silk fabric here on this pair of breeches and on the waistcoat over time has begun to shatter, which is effectively those damaged areas you can kind of see close-ups of there on the left, that where the thread looks totally frayed. And this could have happened to this particular set of garments for a couple of reasons. One is that there's really heavy buttons and buckles on the bottom of the breeches, and the heaviness of those pieces of hardware could have pulled the fragile fabric over time. But also, it could be related to the dye that's being used on this particular silk fabric that might have deteriorated over time. Sometimes certain dyes will do that. Or silk is sometimes coated in a metallic salt that would add additional weight to silk fabric. And this is because silk fabric is often sold by weight in the period. So it's a way to kind of get a little more money for your goods. And it's common to sneak the scales a little bit. But regardless, this type of damage, whether it's from the dye or the salts or the weight of the hardware, that could be the rotten silk that Rebecca is referring to when she's repairing her gown. So by looking closely at some of the mends on some of these garments, we begin to really understand why Rebecca might have struggled to repair it. You can see the repair work in the bottom photo on the left-hand side is showing tiny stitches that are tacking down the loose threads. And there's actually extra pieces of fabric that are on the underside of the breeches that are patching that hole to stabilize the stitches. And this, whoever mended these garments would have had to painstakingly do that to all of the holes. So you can imagine why that would be a bit of a mending nightmare for Rebecca in particular. Looking more closely at some of the other objects in the textile collection here at the museum, multiple decisions had to go into mending early American textiles, including whether to attempt to match the colors of the original fabric with either thread or with patches of fabric that were used to mend it. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you have reserved the same prints of the fabric you first made your objects in, so then you can add them in that way. But not everyone is so lucky, or maybe you didn't have any scraps. This is a patterned pocket, which I find really delightful. And you can already tell that it was made by someone who, maybe one or more women who were incredibly thrifty. They've pieced together multiple scraps of printed fabric in order to even just form the initial shape. And then the brown, white, and a brown and white dotted fabric that's lining the opening to the pocket has then been later patched with another printed scrap. And this is a orange and blue print. You can kind of see there in the center, which dates to a little later than this pocket's initial construction. And then the backing also is pieced with different plain woven fabrics to make the initial shape, but has also been mended multiple times with patches as well. So you can begin to see, like, with the mentality of thriftiness here, that this woman or women who are doing this labor are coming back again and again to extend the life of this object through different mending campaigns, which I find very interesting, that commitment to repairing and returning to repair. In another instance of mending meeting creativity, this is a mid 18th century quilted petticoat turned 19th century quilt, which has experienced layers of repair and refashioning over time. So when this petticoat was converted to a quilt, the slits on either side of the skirt that were once pockets were sewn up. There were once openings for pockets were sewn up, and then the side seams were cut open, and the bottom hems were sewn to make that center seam that you see there in the middle of the quilt. So a bit of jigsaw puzzling to get it back into a flat shape. But the original lining to the quilted petticoat is a combination of what was likely once a former blue skirt for another woolen garment, as well as a large piece of pattern fabric that looks kind of mismatched there in the bottom right corner. And that blue skirt piece was already mended several times with blue thread. And holes in the quilted petticoat were also patched with a sympathetic piece of red broadcloth fabric, which would have matched the red exterior, even if it looks like it really clashes with the interior. But you can see it really obviously, that red patch there on the right side, but that would have helped to hide the hole from the outside. Another, maybe one of the more spectacular mended textile examples in the collection that I was able to study was the 1786 bed rug of Lorraine Collins, which is part of a larger famous set of bed rugs made in Connecticut. And if you are curious about the bed rug making tradition in Connecticut, definitely check out the work of textile historian Lynn Bassett. That's one of her many areas of expertise, and her scholarship's been very helpful to me as I've been understanding this particular object. The bed rug of Lorraine Collins here on the left is very similar to one made by Lorraine's aunt, Elizabeth Foote Huntington, which is on the right. But both were created by a series of outlined sewn shapes that were then filled in with a decorative darning stitch, which is the same, at its core, the same stitch used to repair textiles. But this more decorative form of the darning stitch is often seen on samplers, which are one of the best sources for material evidence of plain sewing education for many women in early America. Samplers were embroidered on woven fabric pieces and then decorated with sewn features like alphabets, short verses, small motifs, and signatures that were created to practice and demonstrate needlework skill. And from the study of samplers, many historians have examined the role of needlework in women's education more broadly, the girls who completed this work and the women who instructed them. And samplers are but one form of evidence of needlework's centrality in women's lives as a critical skill, and crucially, they reflect a spectrum of skill in women's needlework rather than kind of this universal level of competency among women who sewn. Often we maybe assume that all early American women had the same skill sets, but there is a variety there. And darning samplers, which are a rarer subset of the sampler tradition in early America, were designed specifically for women to practice repairing damaged fabric, sometimes by cutting out very small sections of the back fabric and repairing the damage with thread. Other darning samplers don't cut out the fabric, but still practice decorative patterning of darning stitches across the woven fabric. So they're just mimicking the repair. And in lieu of a sampler, Lorraine's bed rug really still is functioning similar to one, showcasing her needlework skills. But what makes this bed rug so special is that it was also heavily mended in its lifetime. sometimes with small woven darns that mend the original ground fabric. You can kind of see those on the left-hand side there, those gray patches that are repairing the backing fabric. And those would have just peeked out to the front. You can kind of see a few of them, but in general, they're pretty invisible. And then in other spaces on the bed rug, there's patches of fabric that were then sewn through to replace lost spaces in the front pattern as they had worn out over time. You can kind of see that there on the right. These two bright white patches are stabilizing the backing fabric, and then new woolen colorful thread is being sewn through them to replace the loss. The original top edge of the bed rug has also been trimmed away, likely because it wore out quickly with use, as bed rugs are pulled up by sleepers and tucked in at night over and over, and that probably began to wear through more than the other pieces of the rug. And if Lorraine was the mender of her rug, which I suspect she might be, then she really put the needlework skills that she learned while making this bed rug to good use, likely motivated by the wish to preserve such a spectacular object that she had put an immense amount of effort into creating, and wishing that it would last as long as possible. Mending was not only women's work, although I've talked about only women so far. Many early American men also mended textiles, whether through their various professions or through special circumstances of necessity. And one such special circumstance was the Revolutionary War, when textiles were desperately needed and often in short supply. And as a result, many soldiers took up needles themselves or sourced female labor from their families back home, sometimes from communities near their camps, or the host of camp followers who often performed other textile tasks, including laundry for pay. The Connecticut Museum's library has a wealth of Revolutionary War records, including records of how textiles were issued and returned for multiple regiments, which helps me understand more broadly textile supply issues for the Continental Army. And they also have a good collection of orderly books, which often record certain orders around the care of textiles in the camp, or often soldiers' appearances. Washington in particular is very anxious about the respectability of his soldiers in the Continental Army and how they appear. And I just pulled this image of a famous painting, many of you may have already seen it, March to Valley Forge, which kind of exaggerates the disrepair of many of the soldiers in the Continental Army who might be missing stockings, or their jackets or their breeches are more rag-like than garment-like. And in Valley Forge in particular, that was probably pretty accurate state of their clothing at certain points in the war's campaign. On a more granular level, the diaries of several Revolutionary War soldiers offer insights into textile repair, but also kind of the chaotic nature of some of the damage that textiles would endure, which had to be mended later in the military. The 1775 Journal of Benjamin Boardman very dutifully records his regularly laundered clothing items, probably for his own records to make sure that everything he's sending to be laundered returns back intact to him. But he's also recording textile mending as a paid service that he was soliciting. Many textiles beyond clothing were also really important to the military cause, such as knapsacks, blankets, and tents in particular. And the 1776 diary of Obadiah Brown notes a really terrible storm that blew down all of the camp's tents at one point. And orderly books also regularly mention the value of keeping tents functional, washed, and repaired, because they were effectively the shelter for many military members. There were also men who had been tailors professionally before they entered the Continental Army as soldiers, and they found themselves doubly valuable to the revolutionary cause, sometimes even directly instructed to pause their other orders and devote themselves full time to clothing the army when things were especially desperate. And they were often mending textiles as well for themselves and their comrades on the side. And Daniel Allen, a Connecticut soldier who was also a tailor, recorded mending multiple coats, shirts, trousers, stockings, vests, and breeches for his fellow soldiers in between action. Also expected to mend as part of their professions, sailors and sailmakers were responsible for mending one of the most important textiles in the broader Atlantic world, and that's of sailcloth. Fabric sails are used to harness wind and power ships, underwent extensive wear and tear, and required regular maintenance. Completed by male soldiers on board ships while at sea, or in the lofts of male sailmakers while in ports, sail repair was a critical form of needlework for the continued connections between early America and a broader Atlantic world of travel and trade. The 1802-1804 Maritime Journal of Elias Williams in the library's collection describes multiple instances of sailors mending sails while traveling to the Bahamas, sometimes as part of regular maintenance on board, often described as ship's duty, and some other circumstances of really intense weather. Bills for professional sailmakers to work on repairing ship sails are also in the library's miscellaneous collection of ship's papers, including the 1767 bill charging the owners of the brig Hartford for Peleg Sanford's work mending a fore topsail and a fore staysail, as well as a process called middle stitching, which honestly I'm still trying to understand fully, but I believe it involves reinforcing the center of sails, and it often correlates with documents that are describing the mending of sails. It seems an important part of the process as well. I also kind of want to pull back the curtain a little bit on the research processes for this project and highlight that early American mending is only studyable when it is collected and identified, which is in fact sometimes harder than you might initially think. Within museum collections, early American textile repair work is sometimes difficult to spot, assuming that mended textiles even make it into museums in the first place. Collecting, whether on a personal or institutional level, has often privileged objects that seem perfect, authentic, and without flaws. And some museum objects may have damage, often due to age and prior storage conditions, but it is much rarer to find damaged objects that were also repaired in the same time periods in which they were made and used. And several reasons, some practical and some less so, kind of explain this absence in the archives. Repairs can be difficult to date, and antique dealers or other collectors in possession of objects before they even arrive in museums may try to repair broken objects before their purchase and acquisition. And while some collections have access to conservators, so their objects receive professional repair, other objects might have received conservation work before entering a collection, which might be difficult for museums to determine when a repair was made. And repairs often escape notice in archival records, object records within collection databases, whether due to the assumption that information about objects' repair is less important than its creation or its use, or because sometimes textile mending is still many years later performing some of that original function and staying hidden. While this can be true of many institutions, I have pulled up one of the catalog entries for the Mended pocket I showed you all earlier that's clearly identified as being a repaired object. And the Connecticut Museum in particular does a really excellent job of signposting repairs within their collection databases, which has made my research all the easier because I don't have to dig as far back just to find those objects. So shout out to you all. So kind of by way of conclusion, repairing our fashion industry, our rates of consumption, and our relationships with the objects that surround us requires both modern day commitment and historical context. And my dissertation research is really interested in the latter. And I've really greatly enjoyed sharing these highlights from the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History with you all today. That's helping me to explore those historical roots of repair. I'm hopeful by the end of my project, I will also be able to offer even more historical models for caring deeply for some of the things around us. And I hope when you next find a hole in your favorite shirt or a favorite jeans, you'll consider repair as an option to extend the life of your clothing just a little bit longer. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I'm happy to engage in any questions or comments. Thank you especially to the New England Regional Fellowship Consortium for allowing me to dig so deeply in the Connecticut Museum's collections. And this project is still in its very early stages of development. So if anyone listening knows of any mended textiles and other collections that you think I should see, I'm happy to take suggestions, and I can be contacted. I put my Instagram and my Twitter handles up there on the screen, but I'm also happy to pass on email. Thank you all so much. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was really excellent. Some really neat pieces that you highlighted. Anybody have any questions? You can feel free to put them in the chat. You can also unmute yourself if that's a little easier. Anybody? We'll give a few minutes.
Yeah, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Hey, Emily, good to see you again. Been a while. Thank you. And it's fascinating to hear you talk about material culture as always. I have a question about if you know anything about this style or patterns that may have been done within the textiles. Did they have any regional or cultural variations? Was there significant in that manner? I'd love to hear about that, if you know.
Yeah, thanks, Kat. It's great to see you. And what a great question. It's got a bit of a complicated answer, and one on which I'm kind of still exploring in my own research. Darning samplers often display these really fancy patterned repairs, mimicking really elaborate woven fabric structures. And they're absolutely gorgeous, but I still have yet to find that particular level of detailed mimicry on actually repaired garments. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that the darning stitch is a little more decorative in those moments than it is functional. And so they take a lot of time to mimic on a darning sampler, but they may not, that the person who is mending some of these garments or other textiles kind of in situ might not have the luxury of that time or the light to complete those patterns. And so they're often going for whatever is the most functional, sturdy option while maybe being as invisible as possible. That's one of my theories for that. So when folks ask me if there's a regional distinction between some of those, if you look only at darning samplers, you might say yes, like that must be, because there are really strong traditions in the Netherlands. Quaker schools in particular are teaching darning samplers, and there's certain patterns that are showing up in those samplers. And so you might assume absolutely yes, on that level, there are some regional distinctions, but I have yet to see it on actual garments, which makes me think that it's not actually something I can segment out regionally, which at the beginning of this project, I thought for sure, like I thought I really expected to find that, and I haven't yet. So it's something I'm still looking for and keeping in mind, and maybe I will find an example that proves me wrong. But at the moment, I think there's a lot more similarities between the basic components of repairing garments than there are differences by region or particular culture. Great question.
We have a question from Lisa. She's asking what threads were used for original creation and mending of garments? Was it silk or cotton or wool?
That's also a great question. It really depends on what the original garments are made of. Often I've seen examples where there has been enough care and attention to the repair to try and match those materials. So let's say that a silk dress is in need of repair, then often silk thread is being used to repair it. And often in the same color as the original fabric. Same with wool. I've seen some woolen blankets that are mimicked with the same color yarn to try woolen yarn in attempts to mimic that weaving structure as it's being repaired. So there is that conscientiousness in some instances, but in other instances, it can really mix. The quilted petticoat I was showing earlier, that patch is done with a red woolen broadcloth, but it's on a totally different fabric type. But in that instance, the color was more important than matching the material, I think, to whoever was doing that mending. But, more broadly, I've seen silk, cotton, wool threads. Often there is also a type of thread called darning thread, and that's usually kind of a thicker white cotton thread. It's actually something you can still find today, marketed under that descriptor in stores. And that is usually most popular. I see that most often on stockings in particular, because stockings are so quickly deteriorating and always are being repaired. And so that's usually where I see it the most.
We have another question. Marcia's asking about, some of the repairs use a piece of fabric, and was there any attempt to use dyes, maybe tea or something, to try to match the fragment to the item?
Ooh, that's a good question. I wouldn't personally be able to confirm if they're using tea without some testing on some of the textiles, but I will say that there is a process in the period called overdying, where often for the secondhand clothing industry, which is actually a really vibrant way of secondhand garments getting into the hands of new owners. Overdying becomes a process where you can then hide damage and wear by dyeing it a darker color. So let's say you're selling your coat. Someone's job is to take that coat, tidy it up as best it can, sometimes repair it if it's needed, and then totally plunge it into a darker color to make it look a little newer or nicer in that moment. It might not last as long as a new coat, but it's one way in which a secondhand clothing market is thinking about consumer needs and interests, and there's definitely a market for that. So that's one instance in which I've seen some of that dyeing that you're describing. But for some of the repairs that I think you're noting where the colors are really different, that also might have something to do with whether it's on the front face, like the public face of the textile, versus the face that would not often be seen by the public. So with quilts in particular, or other bed furnishings, the outer side is where they're most careful to repair damage in a way that wouldn't be totally noticeable at first glance. So some of that white patching on the back of Lorraine Collins's quilt, for example, that would never be seen by anyone probably except herself or someone who's sleeping under the bedrug. And so that kind of public and private division often influences those choices as well.
We have a couple other questions. Does mending reflect the comparatively high cost in money or time of buying versus weaving new fabric?
That's a great question. And I would say yes. Mending is really done because textiles are the most expensive object in early America that anyone could own by far and away. Like if you look at probate inventories, which are documents that when a person has died and their estate is being divided up for sale or division in a will, someone will go into a house and list all of the items that they find in that space that is considered property by that particular person. And textiles are at the top of the list, no matter what. Beds and bedsteads usually are the top parts of that list. So textiles are extremely expensive. And so knowing that especially for imported textiles in early American time period, when they might replace a damaged garment that you might have to wait until it crosses the Atlantic Ocean, then have someone make it into the garment that you're looking for. mending becomes a much quicker and cheaper way to extend the life of garments. So I think that's often people's first choice rather than replacing, especially for some of those more costly items.
And that leads to were stockings often mended with knitted pieces or with a plain weave darning?
This is a great question because it's one that has plagued me for a long time. Knitted, not to get too deep into the weeds here, but knitted fabric, when it earns holes, when holes are made in knitted fabric, the stitches unravel over time. And that's part of the knit structure. If anyone is a knitter, they've probably dropped a stitch before and they understand it will unravel to the bottom if you don't catch it. And so logically, in order to repair a hole in knit fabric, you would want to mimic knit stitch when you repair it. And those examples I have seen on knitted garments and I have seen in knitted samplers. They do exist, that way to duplicate the stitch. But often woven darning is used to repair it instead, because it's probably faster and it's less of a skill than mimicking the duplicate knit stitch. So, but that doesn't always work very well. So I've seen examples where a knitted stocking has got a hole at the top, and you can see that someone has done a little woven darn, and then the stitch has continued to unravel, and then they've had to go down and try and catch it there and woven darn, and then it continues. So you can see these like mending campaigns, these different times in which people are coming back and trying to fix the same repair, but if they had used a skill set correctly the first time, they would have saved themselves a lot of time. So yeah, it is always fascinating to me. But knitted repairs with knit stitches are definitely something that happened. Women are advertising this skill. It is if you had a little bit more money or a little bit more time or a little bit more skill, you would do that on your knitted fabric before woven darning.
And we have another question. Was it a common practice to reuse the quilted petticoat as a bed rug, like we saw in the example?
Oh, a good question. It's certainly wacky. That is one of the examples that I really love, because like clearly the quilted petticoats, skill of execution was something they were interested in preserving, but they just weren't wanting to wear a quilted petticoat anymore. And so switching it to a kind of a whole cloth quilt situation allows it to still function as a quilt, but it just is no longer the quilted petticoat. But I really love that example because of all the layers of thrift that are going on there, that they want to preserve the work that went into that quilted petticoat. It's also very high quality fabric. And so would have still looked beautiful as a quilt, but and they're hiding the most frayed, damaged parts by making it the center seam, because that's where the edges were most damaged, really. So a lot of thought went into that, even though it's a really weird example.
It was hard to tell from the image. Did they try to cover that center seam, or?
They're kind of melding the edges together. It's still an obvious seam, and many whole cloth quilted petticoats will have seams similar to that, just based on the width of the fabric that is being woven. So you can't usually get a whole piece that would cover the width of a quilt. You'd have some strips. So in some ways it's kind of mimicking that form, but when you look closer, you're like, oh, that's definitely just two edges rather than a selvage seam.
It's one more question from Marie about quilts. Were quilts often made from mended fabrics?
Oh, this is another great question. So it really depends on the type of quilt you're talking about. Some whole cloth quilts normally no, because those are some of the most expensive options there. They're really showing off the wealth of having a massive piece of fabric that they can then quilt. But for quilts that are patched, we're thinking about multiple patterns and squares that are then attaching. There's a lot of practices in that type of quilt making that incorporate old pieces of fabric that have been reused. So sometimes you can match, in some collections, you can match garments to quilt pieces that have the same fabric, and you know that they came from the same piece of fabric initially. You can also see quilt squares that have been pieced out. So there are multiple scraps that maybe aren't perfectly square that have been sewn together just to get that square shape. They're really using every scrap possible because they're such a valuable resource to get to maximize its use. So I've seen that as well in quilts, and occasionally I'll see previously mended fabric that then is used in a quilt as well. And the quilted petticoat is actually a great example of that, because the backing, I think, was previously mended when it was once a garment before it even became part of the quilted petticoat, which is another very fun layer in its history as an object.
A lot of layers here. Any other questions for Emily? Anybody? Anyone? This is a really great conversation. This is really interesting. Can't wait to see where this all goes. Before we wrap up today, I would love to just share with everyone a little bit of what we have going on at the museum, some upcoming events. So in 2 days, on Thursday the 16th, we have a program on site. It is a book talk and author signing called Dolls of Our Lives. Allison Horrocks and Mary Mahoney are going to discuss their new book, which combines history, travelogue, and a memoir about their unforgettable journey to delve into the origins of the iconic American Girl dolls. And Riverbend Bookstore will be on site if you'd like to purchase the book. That is for a fee. Then we have our annual GFox behind the scenes tour. We have one tour at 11 on November 25th and another tour on the next day on Sunday the 26th at 2. And so you'll go behind the scenes to some of our collection spaces and get to see a lot of different very unique things in our collection and talk a little bit about GFox and reminisce. And then we have a family program on December 2nd from 11 to 2 called Snow Days. This is great for families, for especially children ages 3 and up, where your family can make a one-of-a-kind snow globe, make a holiday poppers, or decorate holiday cards. So those are just some of our upcoming events. Of course, you can learn about all of our events at connecticutmuseum.org. And I just wanted to say thank you so much, Emily, for an amazing program today. This is really fascinating. And please keep us posted on how things are going. And thanks, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Jen. This was lovely. And I'm excited to be processing even more of my finds.
And we'll see you back soon. Great. Good night. Goodbye, everyone.